Every evening, no matter the weather, four of us gathered in the small parlor of the George Inn in Blackwood. The innkeeper, the undertaker, myself, and an old drunk named Felix. Felix was a strange man. He drank heavily, but there was an air of education about him. He barely worked, yet seemed to have money. His past remained a mystery. That night, the innkeeper joined us, bringing news that would shake Felix to his core. A doctor had arrived in town, a man named Walter Maddox. The name alone shattered Felix's usual stupor. His eyes widened, his hand trembled, and in an instant, the alcohol seemed to evaporate from his system. I saw something awaken in him, a memory, a terror buried deep within. He muttered the doctor's name under his breath, then stood abruptly. His face, once flushed from drink, was now pale as death. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the door. I followed just in time to see him step into the dimly lit hall and freeze. There at the foot of the stairs stood a man in a fine coat, his white hair glistening in the lamplight. At first he looked calm, composed, but when his eyes met Felix's, something changed. His posture stiffened, his face darkened. Maddox recognized him. Felix did not move. He stood firm, his voice shaking yet firm, whispering something under his breath. Whatever words he spoke, they cut deep. Maddox flinched as if struck. Then with a look of sheer panic, he turned, bolted through the door, and disappeared into the stormy night. Felix stood there motionless, watching the empty doorway. When he finally turned back to us, his face was grim, his lips pressed into a thin line. He spoke only once more before vanishing into the cold darkness outside. That man is not safe to cross. I later learned the truth about Felix's past. Once he had been a medical student in Ravenshire. He had worked under a renowned anatomy professor, tasked with receiving bodies for dissection. One night, he was awakened by a knock at the door. Half asleep, he answered, finding two men standing in the darkness. At their feet lay a burlap sack. Felix paid them without question. He had done this before. But as he opened the sack, his blood ran cold. Inside was a woman he had seen alive just the day before. Her name was Jane Galbraith. He had spoken to her, laughed with her, and now she was nothing but cold flesh. Felix wanted to speak up, to call the authorities, but fear wrapped its fingers around his throat. If he said anything, he knew what would happen. He had already accepted bodies without asking questions. How long before he was implicated? He went to Maddox for advice. The man was clever, composed. He barely reacted when Felix stammered out the horror of his discovery. Maddox simply told him to stay quiet, to write down the name, to file it away, and to move on. "It's safer that way," he had said. Felix hesitated, but in the end he picked up the ledger, wrote the name, and closed the book. That was not the last time Felix and Maddox crossed the line. One night they traveled to a graveyard, shrouded in darkness. Their task was simple: retrieve a fresh body and return before dawn. The grave was new, the earth still loose. It took only minutes before their shovels struck the coffin lid. The wood splintered under their tools, revealing the body within. They wrapped it in cloth, stuffed it into a sack, and hurried back to the carriage. But as they rode through the storm, Felix felt uneasy. The sack beside him seemed heavier. He glanced at it, then at the road ahead. The further they traveled, the more the unease grew. And then something happened, something that made his blood freeze. The body shifted. Felix grabbed the lantern. With shaking hands, he undid the ties around the sack. The fabric peeled away, revealing a face he knew too well. It was not the man they had just exhumed. It was someone else. Someone long dead. Someone who should not, could not, be here. It was Gray. Felix and Maddox scrambled out of the carriage, abandoning it to the night. The driverless horses galloped forward, dragging with them the impossible horror in the back. Felix was never the same after that night. He drank more, spoke less. The fire in his eyes faded. Whatever he had seen, whatever had happened on that ride, had broken him. And so he sat night after night in the George Inn, drowning himself in rum, trying to forget. But some things cannot be forgotten.